Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in today to this, which is the fifth and final Live Green UK Sustainability webinar. So as many of you will know, Live Green has been working on a Live Beyond Zero vision and commitment for climate and environmental action from the UK live music community. The vision is really for all parts of the UK's live music community to come together and work towards common aims and commitments. Somewhere you'll all be stronger than the sum of your parts, and also a place where the road ahead is shared so that no single artist, venue, festival, manager, supplier, agent, or other person working in the industry feels like it's all on them alone. The vision at the moment is in draft form, and these webinars are part of a wider consultation to sort of go over what it is, what it means for different parts of the live sector, how we get there. So they're your opportunity to hear more and ask questions, and please do ask your questions and share your thoughts using the chat function. We will leave plenty of time for conversation at the end. To get us all warmed up in using the chat function, please do take the opportunity as well now to say hi, where you're tuning in from. And again, remember that at any point you can just put a question in there and we'll come to them towards the end. So today's spotlight is on artists and management. You can watch back the previous 4 sessions on festivals, venues, touring and offices, all on the Live UK YouTube channel. If you've tuned into any of the others, there's going to be some crossover in terms of content. Less so today, actually, than in some of the previous sessions. But still, if you find your mind wandering, I encourage you to take that moment instead to note down a list of 3 things you're going to do after the session finishes, and by when you're going to do them, and at least 2 people you're going to speak to about climate action. So my name is Chiara. I work at a charity called Julie's Bicycle. I've been part of the working group supporting the Live Beyond Zero vision. And also with me, I'm really pleased, is Ross Patel from Whole Entertainment, who has also been involved in sort of providing feedback at different stages of the vision. And he's also going to share some of the projects he's been working on as a company and with some of his artists. So thank you so much for joining us today, Ross.
Yep. Yeah, nice to be here. Thank you.
Great. Julie's Bicycle, for those of you who don't know, was founded nearly 15 years ago from within the UK music industry to support the industry to take action on climate change and environmental challenges. We still do that, and we also work with the wider performing and visual arts and more through consultancies, certification for offices, venues, festivals and tours, research, training, helping to get new networks and programs off the ground. For example, we helped co-found Music Declares Emergency, sort of leading on writing the top tips you can find on the MDE website. Still part of that working group. Very nice t-shirt, Ross. One of the No Music on a Dead Planet t-shirts representing. So a big thanks to Greg and Live Green for asking us to lead these workshops. And of course, thanks to everyone tuning in. So we'll go to the slides now. If I can ask Ben, who's busy pulling the strings in the background, to do that. Thanks so much. So this is the sort of draft vision. We commit to a regenerative future, taking the lead on climate action and collaborating towards a sustainable society. We acknowledge responsibility for individual and collective actions to make ongoing absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and reach net zero by 2030. We'll work together with our stakeholders to inspire positive change in areas outside our direct control. And the reason, I guess, we're all doing this is that we're in the middle of doing this massive experiment with our only home. We've basically spent the last 100 years geoengineering the planet. We, as humans, are changing the actual composition of the atmosphere. If you think of an apple, the apple's skin is roughly the thickness of that atmosphere around the Earth, and that contains the air we breathe and the various gases that keep usually the planet's temperature sort of in what we might call the Goldilocks zone, so not too hot, not too cold, where we can live. And we call those greenhouse gases because they trap heat like a greenhouse. And at the moment, we're burning through energy that's stored up by plants over millions of years and was buried underground, and we're burning through that in the space of about 100 years. So if you imagine that atmosphere, that apple skin, as a bathtub with all the taps running, we've added some extra taps and a bucket. We're putting more greenhouse gases in than any natural processes can remove. And so that means the bathtub or the atmosphere is quickly filling up. The amount of carbon dioxide now in the atmosphere is the highest it's been for at least 800,000 years. And we can measure that geological change on cultural timescales. So before the Industrial Revolution, before we started burning all the fossil fuels, there were around 280 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. By 1871, when the Royal Albert Hall opens, we're still at about 288 parts per million. By the time the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, that's climbed to 325 parts per million. When Kylie releases Kylie 20 years later, we jump another 26 parts per million to 351 parts per million. And then by the time Dizzy Rascal releases Boy in the Corner in 2003, we're at 377. And in the 18 years since, we've actually climbed to 417. So that's 50% higher than where we started. And half of all the emissions we've actually emitted since that pre-industrial time, we've released in the last 30 or so years. The speed and the scale of that is pretty daunting, but I think it's also worth thinking about it in the way that if we got here that fast, we can move really fast to shift course again if we put everything that we've got into it. So all those extra greenhouse gases in the atmosphere means that it's now hotter than it's been in the entire history of human civilization. We're kind of in uncharted territory, toppling those temperature records all over the place. And the climate is not going to stop changing until we stop putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So this is a one-way. Climate change isn't really reversible on most ways that we might understand that. So the weird weather that we're seeing now is here to stay, but we decide how much worse it's going to get. And it's not an over-exaggeration to say that the decisions that we're making now are going to set the course for the next millennium on this planet. And what matters isn't just how much extra greenhouse gases we're putting in the atmosphere in a given year, but how much we've put in total over time. So we have to roughly halve global emissions every decade from here on, get to net zero carbon emissions globally by 2050. That's 30 years, and that means that we, the people who are alive and working now, effectively have to solve climate change. This is our now, and sometimes it can be quite unhelpful to think of climate change as an issue. It's more like this is the time that we live in. It's going to change our work and our lives and the way that we work, either because we choose to live up to the moment and take action and make change, or because we don't and live with the consequences of that changed atmosphere. So that's where that vision really comes from, is we commit to a regenerative future, taking the lead on climate action, collaborating towards a sustainable society. It's about getting together, doing something about it in a way that can be quite a hopeful act. It's sort of a promise for something better. We are gonna tackle this. And we can do that by doing two things. We, and when I say we, I mean especially those of us who are living in Europe, North America, and other parts of the world that have contributed a lot more historically to those greenhouse gas emissions and continue to be responsible for more emissions than people living in other parts of the world. We have to cut our impacts, and we have to push for bigger picture change. So we have to ask for changes in laws, policies, investments, using whatever platform we have to ask for and to demand change. If you've heard the phrase net zero, that is an idea that comes from this knowledge that the climate is not going to stop changing until we stop filling the bathtub. So we have to get to a point where globally sources of greenhouse gas emissions have to be equal to or less than the sinks. That means we reduce our emissions, we get to nearly zero, and then the leftover bits we net by removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. But we can't just net ourselves out of the level of stuff we're putting in the atmosphere every year now. We don't have enough land to plant trees. We don't have the kind of technology that's needed to meet or undo the damage that we're doing. Just relying on this idea of greenhouse gas removals without also doing the reductions would be a bit like trying to use a cup or even a thimble to try to get water out of that bathtub while the fire hose is still pumping water in. We're not going to get very far. So on a whole economy scale, more or less the only thing we're netting out in the UK by 2050 is some air travel and some agricultural emissions. So net zero isn't really keep everything the same and pay for some offsets. Net zero is change the way that we make energy, change the way that we heat our homes, change the way that we get around, change what we eat. So for more on some of the technical detail of that, I'd encourage you to watch back one of the other workshops that we've done, especially if you're an office-based business. I would encourage you to watch the office one. But in summary, we have to clean up electricity, shift to non-fossil fuel energy generation. The largest source of greenhouse gas emissions is our burning of those so-called fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas for energy, for electricity, heating, transport, the diesel we use in our cars and planes. So we have to change how we make the electricity that goes in the grid. We have to shift away from using gas for heating our buildings. We have to stop burning diesel and petrol in our cars and generators. The other big area is electrify everything. So all the stuff that we're currently powering directly by burning fossil fuels, again, that gas for heating, the diesel and petrol in our cars and trucks and generators, we have to change that so it can run on our new clean electricity, either through battery power or being connected to the grid. We have to reduce demand, use less, and become more efficient. So, for example, electrifying everything doesn't just mean cleaning up our current electricity supply. It actually means building lots more clean energy. And that means the more efficient we are, the less new renewable energy capacity we have to build. We also have to use less because at the moment we're using too much energy and land to feed into all the stuff we're consuming. So food, feed, fiber, timber, energy, all of that stuff. And we need to free up some of that land as well to give it back to nature to help reverse some of the mad biodiversity crisis that's also unfolding around us. And we need some of that land to grow more trees to help us draw more of that extra carbon back out of the atmosphere. So again, we can free up land by using less resources, and we can free up land by eating less meat and dairy because it takes twice as much land to both grow the feed for the animals and then for the animals themselves. And lastly, we have to think about how we capture and remove the rest. So why are we here? Why are we doing this? Most importantly, it's kind of the right thing to do. It's the only thing we can do, being alive in this moment. But also it's the right thing to do because it matters to those we work with. In the UK, 8 in 10 people are either very concerned or fairly concerned about climate change, and those statistics are roughly the same actually across the world. Most people are concerned about this. So by taking action, you can address that, you can respond to that. We're responding to climate emergency declarations. We're responding to Fridays for Future school strikes. We're responding to people, again, demanding that some kind of action is taken. There's something here about this also being a creative challenge. We're reinventing our place in the world. We're reinventing the world and the way that we live in it. There's also something about solidarity with other artists around the world who we work with creatively, again, who may already be experiencing actually much bigger impacts from our changing climate than we are here in Europe. And we're responding to that risk of a changing climate. The infrastructure that the international music industry relies on is as vulnerable to climate change as any other. Venues in heat waves start sweltering. You can't put on a gig when the temperature out there is over 40 degrees. Festivals in heat waves and downpours. We've seen tour buses being unable to take certain routes because of high winds. Storms like Sandy or other extreme weather that's cancelling shows. So we're as sort of vulnerable to this changing climate as any other part of our economy. And it's also an opportunity to work together towards something positive. There are opportunities in this change. So linking what we're doing to social justice, to better health and mental health, both in the industry and outside it, to thinking about how we create a fairer and better world, actually. So coming back to that draft vision, we commit to a regenerative future, taking the lead on climate action, collaborating towards a sustainable society. We acknowledge responsibility for individual and collective actions to make those ongoing absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and reach net zero by 2030. And we'll work together with our stakeholders to inspire positive change in areas outside our direct control. So what that really means is that for the next 10 years, our focus as an industry is on reducing emission, working with others to reduce theirs and asking for change. The net zero by 2030 the net from 2030 means that there's a commitment that from 2030 you'll match any remaining emissions with an equivalent amount of greenhouse gas removals. But that sort of net of the removals really comes after a focus on reductions over the next 10 years. The sort of draft declaration says we will work towards the following: work with Live Green to reduce our operational and business travel greenhouse gas emissions, set reduction targets in line with the Live Green vision, measure and report progress annually, develop a net zero roadmap and action plan, understand and define emissions within our value chain, follow best practice to affect change in areas outside of our direct control, collaborate with suppliers and clients towards the vision, ensure our people undertake climate literacy education and have an ongoing commitment to knowledge sharing within the live music sector and beyond, and talk to our stakeholders honestly about the impacts of our business on the environment and efforts we're making towards a regenerative future. So for management and artists, if you are here from a management company, from an agency, from another office-based business that's supporting artists, I'd encourage you to also look back again at the office workshop where we sort of took apart that vision in a bit more detail about what it means for that kind of business. But in terms of this commitment to measure and publicly report emissions, for offices, it means the electricity and gas you use on site, if you own or operate any vehicles, how much fuel you're using. For business travel, it's keeping track, especially of flights and hotel nights. For tours, again, I'd encourage you to look at the touring workshop where we sort of looked at this in a bit more detail. But again, it's sort of liters fuel used in your trucks and your buses or cars or vans, number of flights, any other sort of distance traveled by other means. If you're bringing in any generators, extra generators for your shows, how much fuel is being used in those, and also the sort of show power use at the venue, the electricity use. For artists, there's a key piece here in terms of, again, keeping travel records, that business travel, how much are you traveling in a year? But crucially, I think there's something important about working with and tasking everyone in your team, every company that you work with, to make their own commitment to sign up to the vision and to follow these commitments. To, again, for the businesses to set a reduction target that covers these areas, and come up with your team with an action plan to achieve reductions and to push for that change in the industry. Another really important area is that one around climate literacy and learning. So especially where as artists, I think especially at certain places in their careers that can make a real difference. How do you embolden and empower the people who work with the artists to take action and get up to speed? And that might include freelancers that you're hiring to work on tours. How do you give them the time actually to implement those sustainability initiatives? But again, just making this a core part of what you want to achieve and what's important to you so that you're giving them permission to run with it. Putting climate on the agenda. Again, all kinds of stuff tends to get done in the name of artists, sometimes rightly so, sometimes more stupidly so. So if we set environment, or if artists set environment and climate as a really explicit sort of aim and consideration with your teams and everyone who works with you, then you're making sure that it's in their thinking too. And they might come up with all kinds of solutions that seemed impossible otherwise. So really we can split this into sort of three areas. There's how the live music businesses and events are run, how we role model the green investments and actions that we need in that, how we support audiences, artists and others we work with to do the right thing, and then how you use your platforms to call for and support change. Again, I think we do sometimes put too much responsibility on just artists to step forward. There's a whole lot the live music industry can and needs to do that doesn't actually need a single artist to do very much. But we do also know that artists speaking out, not even necessarily publicly, can be a huge lever for change in terms of getting that change in how we operate. Of course, if artists, how much power you feel you have might depend on the level of career you have or feel you have, but I think all of us do have the power in the conversations we have with people to step forward and talk and bring up climate. It's also useful to think in terms of levels of influence and levers of influence, and where you can make change. So there's what's in your control. You decide what you make or get manufactured, the environmental standards it has. You decide who you work with. There's what you influence. So what your partners do, how your audiences are traveling to shows. And then there's stuff that's kind of out of your immediate control, things like environmental standards in legislation. One of the things that's currently being debated at government level is standards for imports of things like timber and wood. And actually, when the legislation on stuff like that gets stronger, it benefits all of us. So that's an area that's outside of your direct control, but that you can campaign on because it's going to make a difference. When we think of artist action plans, I think we can think about what you say and what you create as an artist, and then what you do and what you sell. So on that level of what you say and what you create, there's asking for change in the industry. So again, making environmental impact a key consideration that everyone, management, agent, label, PR, any partners know about. Making someone responsible for overseeing those commitments, including the monitoring and reporting data and taking action. That might be a manager, it might be someone else on the team. Putting in place that sort of action plan or statement of intent, why this matters, what you want to achieve, that can be shared as well with partners or prospective partners to open that conversation. Having a public information page that sort of outlines what you're doing, what actions you're taking, asking venues, festivals, others to take action too. Again, really focusing on those big asks, especially for larger tours, bringing those up at booking. Things like, is the venue powered by renewable energy? Is it accessible by public transport? Can you share your own environmental policy action plan? Who's the key contact for sustainability questions? Then the second sort of area is around asking for change in the world. So supporting and aligning with environmental and climate campaigns, using your platform to speak out, share the platform with others, whether that's artists who are bringing environmental NGOs to their shows, sort of helping them connect with their audiences, raising up the voices of climate justice campaigners, again, sharing that platform, supporting fundraisers. There's a lot there. We have such a rich history of sort of philanthropy and also, making change in the music industry that can be drawn on. And lastly, sort of getting creative, new partnerships, collaborations, sort of letting creativity take hold. On the second area, sort of what you do and what you sell, is this idea of how do you thread environmental considerations through an artist's career. Again, on the touring side, please do also look at the touring workshop, but it is about setting environment as a priority from the start throughout the design, planning, routing, venue choice, what partners or suppliers you're working with, how the show is designed, how you're getting it on the road. Empower the production team to lead and take action, build it into budgets where you can, ask those venues and festivals you're playing at to meet certain environmental standards, use a green rider on tour, and I think be conscious of show planning timelines. So Carol from Tate Towers and Sustainability and Production Alliance made the really important point in the touring webinar that for bigger shows, the timelines really, really matter. If you are going to get your set and your show built on a very short timeline, then that means companies like hers do not have the opportunity to design it better to fit in less trucks. They don't have the opportunity to look at different materials. They don't have the opportunity to look at what they can build using reused components. So again, do please look at the touring workshop as well on that. On merchandise, print on demand to minimize waste. Overstock is an issue. It's wasted resource ultimately. Meeting minimum social and environmental standards, things like organic cotton, the Global Organic Textile Standard, Fair Trade Cotton, Fair Wear Foundation, or other workers' rights certifications. Fabrics that incorporate recycled material or clothing that's made from more sustainable fibers. And when you're choosing your merchandise partners, look for partners and printers that, again, have their own environmental commitments, that are powered by renewable electricity, If they're larger companies, look for something called ISO 14001 certification, which is about how they manage energy in their factories. Think creatively about upcycling overstock. The 1975 did a great project where they screen printed overstock that was left over from a previous tour. I think Tool made overstock into custom blankets that they sold for an absolute fortune. So you can get creative on reuse, on upcycling, on different types of more ethical merchandise as well. For releases, choose recording studios powered by renewable energy. Ask them for their environmental policy and action plan. Ask your label for theirs, policies and commitments. Choose card packaging over plastic jewel cases for CD releases. Lorde just announced that she's not releasing a CD version of her latest album because she doesn't like the environmental cost of CD products. Choose post-consumer recycled card, or as a minimum, something that's FSC certified or sustainably certified. Avoid stuff like glossy laminates, UV inks that can make any card harder to recycle. And again, ask to work with manufacturers who are powered by renewable electricity or that have their own environmental targets. Choose 140 gram vinyl instead of 180 gram. It's a really quick way to reduce the environmental impact of that product because you're just using less material that goes into it. Measuring and pricing your emissions. So again, I think scope emissions during tour planning. Look back at the tour workshop for more info on that. And also, crucially, track your annual travel emissions as an artist, and then set a price per ton of emissions that you can invest in climate projects or make donations to climate justice causes, and ask partners to track and report their emissions as well. On travel, identify international trips that can be avoided, travel by train rather than flying. If you have to fly, again, this is not always possible, but where it is possible, try to fly economy. Business class is 3 times and first class nearly 4 times the impact. On food, go meat and fish free for your rider, reduce food waste, ask venues at play at to have vegetarian and vegan options available to the public. On energy, switch to 100% renewable electricity at home, ask everyone you work with to do the same. And on partnerships, evaluate possible commercial partnerships, sponsors, endorsements. Are they environmentally sound? Ask follow-up questions on greenwash. So on travel, I just wanted to bring this up. So travel, how you travel makes a real difference. You can see there the difference in impact, again, between a long-haul flight, business class per passenger per kilometer versus a short-haul flight, a long-haul flight in economy class, or if you compare, say, the Eurostar against a short-haul flight. Flying, I know it often tends to be a huge focus in these conversations, and there's a lot the live music industry can do outside flying, but I think it's always worth understanding why we spend so much time talking about flying. And it's because it's one of the most energy intense forms of consumption, and it's one of the most unequally distributed in the world. And we don't really have a pathway to a zero carbon technology for flights in the same way that we have one, say, for electric cars. So only 2 to 4% of the global population flew internationally at all in 2018, and 1% of the world's population emits 50% of the carbon from commercial aviation. So one of the reasons flying becomes such a focus is because it's an individual action that probably has the biggest impact as an individual that you can make. And also on a global scale, we're at a place where we cannot fly more. So the amount of flying we were doing before the pandemic hit, we shouldn't be growing globally across that. And because there's already so much more flying going on in Europe and the US, actually we need to start reducing the amount we fly here. But the other thing that's really important for artists is that second part that we talked about in terms of action plans. So what we're selling, what the artist name gets attached to. And I think there is this moment now where we have to get really smart on climate partnerships, and we have to do that really quickly because climate and environment are becoming big business. And that means a lot of advertising and marketing spend is about to go into promoting companies' green credentials. And I think managers need to get smart on how we evaluate those offers and make decisions, how we identify greenwash and sort of riskier proposals, understand where those companies' green credentials actually start and end, and ultimately what we want to endorse through the music industry. So definitely start asking follow-up questions if an offer comes to you. So is that company or business contributing positively to the future we need? What kind of commitments do they actually have in-house? If they're asking for promotion of a specific product, is that product ultimately very much part of the fossil fuel industry? Is it really better than the alternatives? Do you have any red lines for things that you would or wouldn't promote? So there is this big shift as well in the wider advertising world that I think it's worth to be aware of. This idea that if money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns, then PR campaigns and snappy catchphrases are the kindling. So there's a campaign started in the US called the Clean Creatives Campaign, which is asking advertising agencies to decline any contracts with the fossil fuel industry and asking clients to commit that they won't work with agencies that have any fossil fuel industry clients. And here in the UK, there's another campaign called Badvertising, which is targeting specifically SUV adverts. So SUVs were actually the second largest contributor to the increase in global carbon emissions since 2010. SUVs as in bigger and bigger cars, which I think was a surprise to pretty much everyone when the numbers came in. But for every electric car that we're selling, ultimately the benefit that's done has been outdone by the growth of SUVs and bigger cars that use more and more fuels. So, if you're offered a campaign that's linked to a fossil fuel company, I would think very carefully at the moment, even if it's offered by a fossil fuel company for a specific clean energy project, because their spend as companies on fossil fuels R&D tends to still be much higher than it is for renewable energy. So Shell, for example, has just been told by a Dutch court that their climate commitments are not enough. And this is a really big debate as well in the art sponsorship world. So the school strikes have recently been targeting the Science Museum in some very high profile strikes about the support that they get from fossil fuel companies. And lastly, I just want to take a minute on offsetting. So this idea that you can balance or compensate or neutralize the carbon emissions from a given activity by paying into a scheme or project that's going to reduce emissions somewhere else. So we should see that as a last resort in our carbon management strategy, really being quite honest with ourselves, whether we are using offsets as a substitute for other action. And if so, we should not be making offsets part of our climate solutions box. I get asked a lot how much a ton of carbon actually costs, and that depends a bit on how you're calculating that cost. So if you're buying an offset credit on the offset market, it can be really cheap. It can be as cheap as £6 to £7 per tonne. The fair trade minimum price for those carbon credits tends to be £8 to £13 per tonne, depending on what kind of project it is. And those costs are basically the cost of implementing that project that is meant to reduce emissions somewhere else, divided by the number of tonnes it's supposedly saving. And then you as the consumer can buy those credits. There's another way of calculating cost in things like the emissions trading systems. That's a government set market for carbon, where you set a certain limit on how many credits there can be in the system, and then companies have to compete to buy them. So in the EU emissions trading system at the moment, the cost is €50 per tonne of carbon. And then there's the idea that you want to set a price per tonne of carbon that's actually going to create change. So that's going to be enough of an incentive for people to actually change their behaviors and to reduce emissions instead. So a think tank called the Grantham Institute has suggested that the carbon price in 2020 should start at £40 per tonne, and it should be 125 pounds per tonne or more in 2050 for emitters in the private sector to help create that change. So if you want to sort of peg an internal price per tonne, that could be a really useful starting figure. And lastly, there's this idea of the social cost of carbon. So how much damage is that emission of carbon actually causing to people, to land? And there the figures are much, much higher, from $200 per ton to 417. Recently, there was one which was over $1,000 per ton. And so again, if we're thinking about how we're pricing our emissions, I think that's really important to keep in mind. Carbon credits can be a bit of a race to the bottom because they're trying to become as cheap as possible if you're making them part of your offsetting solution. So if you want to price those emissions, yeah, you can buy your offsets on the carbon market. There's a sort of specific systems that have grown up around the carbon market that are supposed to help make sure they're quantified and quantifiable and have certain standards. You can adopt a more DIY approach. So again, calculate your carbon footprint, set your own price per ton, and then use that money to invest in a climate justice project or to make a donation to support a campaign. Examples of that are Earth Percent, which is a new music industry initiative trying to get people to commit a percentage of income every year to climate causes. Equilibrium as well works to make donations to renewable energy projects and to tree planting. Also, I know Client Earth has been working a lot with the music industry, again, on that basis of actually give us a donation, and with that donation, we will change the law to really shift the dial on climate. You can also, if you set an internal price on carbon, you could also put some of that aside to actually pay for your environmental projects, again, so that you're helping to create a fund that helps you reduce emissions in the first place. Or you can look at doing direct investments into projects that have an environmental and financial return. So for example, Future Energy Artists in Australia created a managed fund to help artists invest in solar energy and actually get the returns on that investment. So if you want to have a go at calculating your business travel emissions, you can use the JB Creative Green tools for free. If you want to look into more detail into some of the things we've just talked about, there's lots of free practical guides and resources, or watch back the previous live webinars. I'm just going to run through some really quick examples and then bring in Ross to talk about some of the work that they've been doing. So Jack Johnson has an All at Once foundation and tour commitment. So they really look at fan engagement at the events, at his concerts. So working with a whole NGO village, they calculate and offset emissions from tours, including giving audiences the opportunity to pay into that fund as well. Neil Young did an Honor the Treaties tour, actually to raise funds to support the First Nations legal action against the Canadian tar sands expansion in Canada. He also sort of protested against Barclays' sponsorship of British Summertime due to their investment in fossil fuels. The 1975 did that track featuring Greta Thunberg. And again, that screen printing project I just mentioned. Radiohead actually worked as early as 2007, 2008 to look at what it would take to create the most environmentally sustainable tour. And they pushed a lot of things, including the development at the time of new LED stage lighting fixtures to reduce the amount of power the show would take. Stepping into that as well, Massive Attack working with the Tyndall Centre to better understand the carbon impacts of their tours and shows, and working with the Good Business Festival in Liverpool now to create a trial sort of super low carbon music event and what that would look like. On a slightly different scale, Lucy Rose, who was an emerging artist, worked with a charity called Rubies in the Rubble that works with disadvantaged women. And she created sort of a line of these more ethical jams as merchandise, as a different kind of product that you might sell. Nova Amor did this amazing video for his track Birthplace, which actually won Independent Video of the Year, which really highlighted plastic pollution as an issue. He used a Green Rider on tour and balanced the tour emissions with Equilibrium. And he's got a sustainability page on his website sort of outlining all of that. And the vinyl record was manufactured from factory floor recycled colored vinyl pellets that were left over from other limited edition color runs. Wojtek is a Polish artist who just did this project trying to understand the carbon emissions from recording his album. So he did things like recording in a studio that uses renewable energy, and then sort of put it all on his website for others to see. Enter Shikari have been using the climate stripes to start conversations. So they were developed by scientists at the University of Reading as a really quick and visual way to show the warming temperatures over time. Each year has a stripe that slowly goes from blue to red. So they've been using that as very strong imagery to start conversations about climate change. And then Love Sega is an artist we've been working with at Julie's Bicycle as well, supporting him to do a project around air pollution and climate justice and environmental justice as part of our Season for Change project. So he's released a track about air pollution from the South Circular in London. And also Sega is one of the sort of ambassadors for Earth%. So I think all of this, we really want to think in terms of how we reduce our environmental impact, but also how do we bring our creativity to fighting climate change, to fighting for social justice, to fighting for livable cities and places, and restoring nature. And there's so much help and community out there. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ross, if you're here.
I'm here. Yep. Thank you so
Great.
much. Yeah, I just wanted to say a quick thank you, really, for all the work Julie's Bicycle and yourself and Music Declares have been doing. It's really great kind of seeing the process, and just for anyone watching, I highly encourage everyone to go and find the free resources that are available online, because I think without that, I wouldn't be at this point in my sort of climate action journey. So it's really good to kind of see it displayed in this way. So if I'll just carry on with some of the work that we've been doing as a company. So as you've shown, there's lots of things that people can be doing, and I feel like we are all on our own journey, and everyone will have a different step to take. I'm just going to show a few of the things that we've been doing as a business that we feel are making some kind of impact. But I think also, as well as us doing it, it's about sharing it and encouraging others to do the same or do their own form of it. So Counter-Sin is an initiative that sits under the UNCCC umbrella. It's also part of the Race to Zero and acts as an aggregator for individuals to take steps towards reducing their emissions and their impact on the climate. As a company, we've kind of put a policy in place internally, encouraging staff to sign up to steps that we check in every week to see how people are doing. As a company, we'll kind of offer support to help people achieve what they've set out to do. And then at the end of 2 months, Counter-Sin will give you a figure as to how much those steps have amounted to. There's 16 to choose from currently, and the steps that we chose as a business, which we've now hit. So we've completed our 2 months, and so we've reduced our CO2 emissions by 1,497 kilograms. And it was, I think, relatively easy. Some steps harder than others. But again, it's about choosing the things that work for you, and just taking that first step. So if we go on to the next one. So this was similarly to some of the other artist campaigns that we saw in the previous slides. This was a couple of kind of joint campaigns that we put together as part of World Environment Day that we tied on to the release of Billy Lockett's recent EP and his socially distanced tour that we completed in May. So the first part was part of our commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2030. We've also signed up to Race to Zero and the SME Climate Hub, two amazing resources that have really kind of helped as a business structure these steps that we can take and also find additional information should we need it. So if we go to the next slide. Perfect. So what we looked at doing was creating CDs and vinyl, of which there would be limited edition signed copies. We had 500 copies of those, no plastic wrapping, and all kind of card cases to reduce the impact on that. And we sold 500 copies within about 48 hours. each copy we were committing to planting a tree. And I think one interesting thing with this is that, as Billy's awareness of climate issue was pretty limited, I think, before we presented this with an idea. So he'd really kind of gone from not really being engaged in the conversation at all to being really on board with the idea of doing something because he felt it was different. He was excited by it. He really understood the impact that it was going to have, and we shared the commitment. So he was kind of donating half, and we as a company were donating half, and it was that collaborative effort that I think made it as exciting as it was to do it, and I think that translated and then resulted in the record selling out so quickly. So then we also worked with Choose. They're a similar company to Equilibrium. They're a carbon calculation company where you can also offset those calculations. And I think to the point of offsetting, I think the general understanding is it's not a long-term solution, but when it comes to things like touring and travel, we are limited to what we can do in the short term. So I think rather than feeling a sense of climate paralysis and not taking any action at all, because you're aware that carbon calculating is not 100% accurate or the long-term solution, that's okay. Just do it because it's better than doing nothing. Take your first step, learn about the process, and then at least you have something that you can measure. And that's kind of been our approach to this. We're very much learning as we go through it. But trying to encourage clients to take a look at this and engage with it in a way that is relatively easy and cheap. So we committed to offsetting 200% of the travel emissions for the socially distanced tour. So if we go to the next slide, then and one more. And then, there we have the amounts that we calculated. So the total travel was 1,217 miles for 0.84 tons. We rounded it up to a ton and then doubled it. So we're effectively offsetting a ton each, and that was it. It was really straightforward, and we're happy to do it. We kind of put on the posters that the travel was going to be climate positive. And that was relatively straightforward. So I think an easy thing for people to do if they're looking for something to do to take that first step. Great. I think we could show. This would be a good one to show. So as well as kind of taking company initiatives and I guess the more sort of day-to-day climate action that you can look at both as a company and with kind of clients collaboration. There's also the brand partnership piece that Chiara touched on earlier. So Finister with a company that I'd been speaking to for a while. They're kind of very well known and respected for their kind of sustainable ethics, and just their general sort of ethos was a great fit for Elder Island. They kind of sit perfectly together. And I'd seen that they announced they just become a B Corp, which is a really high level kind of certification for companies who are really committing to a social impact change, usually with kind of climate at the heart of it. So we worked together to create this piece for a launch of a new product. And it was a great exchange, I think, and where it all just kind of fitted together nicely.
Unwind, and having such quick access to nature, it just helps. There's so many natural rhythms as well that exist in the outside world. It's just an essence of sound, isn't it? And it's just capturing it in some way and putting it back into music.
So the kind of real basis of that piece was finding rhythms in sound and in nature. And I think both the band and the brand together really have this kind of deep appreciation for nature and the need to protect it. So by working with the brand, we were able to kind of really use that as a mouthpiece for their interest and their engagement in the issue. A couple of other things just to quickly touch on that we've been doing as a company. We've launched a kind of meat-free Mondays kind of policy where we encourage all the staff to go meat-free on a Monday, and then once a month when we're together in the office, the company covers that, and we'll kind of have lunch together. That's kind of completely plant-based. And we've also moved all of our pensions over to responsible pension funds. Again, all of these things I would say have been pretty easy, and it gets much easier once you do your first thing. I think that I feel like there are kind of 3 key phases that people go through with regards to the climate issue, and it's sort of this resistance to the information because it can be very daunting and overwhelming. Then there's the sort of acceptance of it when you realize that, you know, it's not going away and most of it is probably true. And then there's the action part. And I think once you kind of get there, you kind of realize that taking these actions can be incredibly empowering. I think that there are lots of things that give us more control than we had previously. And I feel like that's, you know, it's a very positive step in the right direction when you start using what you're aware of to make changes in your own lives, as well as what you do as a business or kind of with your work. And that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Ross. I would absolutely agree with that. It's like, just start, do your first thing. If you're listening now, you know, write down the first thing that you're going to do and just go and do it. We've had, if any of you have any questions, this is the time to ask them. We have had one through, which is, do you have any advice for shifting our artist merchandise fulfillment services to something greener? I can have a first go at some thoughts, and then Ross, I don't know if you've
Sure.
had an opportunity to look into this as well. So
Yeah.
I think, and we've talked about this before, if there's a supplier that you have a good relationship with to begin with, always have that conversation with them to begin with. Sit down with them and go, look, this is what we're trying to achieve. How can you help me? And it might be that they're just waiting for you to ask, and they have a lot of stuff that's sort of ready to go, but they haven't wanted to or known how to bring it up. I think in terms of things to look out for is, the packaging approach. So how much packaging they're using, what kind of packaging material. So asking them, you know, what is your policy on sourcing packaging material? Is it preferably post-consumer recycled, which means it's been out, it's been used by people, then it's come back in for recycling? Or as a minimum, does it have some kind of certification like FSC, which means it's from sustainably certified forests? But especially for packaging materials, it's really better if it's got recycled content in it, because we don't need that stuff to be high quality. It just needs to protect goods. I think asking them what they're doing to reduce the amount of packaging that gets used as well, really important. How do we redesign our whole process so that we can use less stuff to begin with? And make it lighter, especially for transport, because how heavy something is helps influence how much energy is needed to actually move it around. So if you're using really heavy packaging material, you're actually wasting a ton of fuel when you start adding it up over the amount of stuff that gets transported. And then, you know, asking them if they are directly sort of controlling any of their fleet, what their plans are for bringing in things like electric vans and couriers for that, what's called sort of last mile, which is sort of the last bit of distribution in a city. You can also, there are lots of cycle couriers now that do some amazing work, which is totally, pretty much as close as we're going to get to zero carbon. So again, asking them sort of, you know, what credentials do the companies they have, they work with have, and what are the plans there on slowly phasing out vans and other vehicles that are powered by diesel and petrol, and either shifting to electric vehicles or shifting to alternatives like cycle couriers. And then also timelines is a really big one. So if you can move stuff by sea freight, that makes an immediate massive reduction on the carbon footprint of the stuff you're moving. But it does mean you can't be doing last minute fulfillment in the same way. So that's more on the distribution side rather than the client sort of fulfillment side. But it is one, again, to ask about. I don't know, Ross, whether you've had any.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was definitely kind of thinking along the lines of the electric vehicles when they become more widely available. Using cycle couriers, I think, is a great idea. I think just on a very sort of practical and logistical kind of tip is kind of sending things to fulfillment centers or distribution centers that are going to be the closest to the end user or the end consumer. So if you're kind of shipping into Europe, just send it to one warehouse that's in Europe, so it's much closer. And then I would say reduce the amount of shipments that you make, if at all possible. So once you're sending a bulk load of product out, just kind of try and do it that once, so that there's fewer trips to make, both from the kind of manufacturing center and then to the consumer at the end. But absolutely, just have the conversation with people and see what setup they have, because electric vehicle kind of delivery services and cycle is becoming more and more widely available. So I think just encouraging people to use it is obviously going to be a benefit.
Brilliant. Any other questions coming through? If not, I'll ask you a question, Ross. I guess from what you've implemented so far and the conversation that you've had with some of your clients, how open are people? I think there is a bit of a nervousness, I think, because, as you say, everyone goes through that movement of feeling quite overwhelmed and then slowly opening up to it. So how have you been tackling the conversations with your clients, and how have they gone?
It's been very varied, I would say, and sometimes unexpected reactions to the conversation, and you never really know how people are going to react to it, I think. And I don't think that's just on the client facing thing. It's kind of as us as individuals. I think we get unexpected answers from people all the time when you try and have a conversation with someone about it. I think it's just to try and be as supportive and encouraging as possible without being pushy, and also what we've tried to do is lead by example and show how easy it can be to kind of take that first step to implement things that work for you, and hope that people will kind of do their best to approach it in a way that works for them. I also think, the collaborative element, encouraging, partnerships and working together to achieve a common goal is going to help, because you can do the heavy lifting for them. Certainly on the client facing side, I think that often helps. So yeah, I think that's it, and just kind of keep bringing it up. Always, I think we're now into our stride with it to some degree. So it's always a point on the agenda. It's kind of, what are we doing for social impact? What are we doing for climate action? How does that tie into our plans as a company? And I think as long as it's constantly there at the forefront, it's not going to get missed when you go on tour, or when you have a release coming up, or you're expanding or moving into an office, or what have you. So yeah.
Brilliant. So threading it through every conversation somehow. We've got another question, which actually touches on something we discussed before this session, which is, our merch is slowly becoming more sustainable and the cost per item has increased. Do you have any suggestions for the messaging we should use to fans on social media so that they understand and support? So I know you have some strong thoughts on this, Ross, if you want to go for it.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that if you can justify the increase in the cost of a product to manufacture because of the sustainable impact, or the reduction of impact it has, we should absolutely be communicating that in a way that consumers can find that information, because we know from studies that it has an impact, a very positive impact. People will actively choose something that they are aware, or they feel is going to have a reduced impact. So I think it's an important thing to do. We should choose to do those things. I think as businesses, as individuals, artists, we have to accept that we're going to take a hit on profit. And I think I did that relatively early on when I kind of did like for like comparisons. And if you're going to do a bulk manufacture of 500 or 1,000 low quality t-shirts, you're going to make less money versus if you make a really high quality product and you're doing a print on demand service. I think depending on what you do and how much you're pricing that product up, the difference can be marginal, but I do think we're currently in a position where there will be a reduction on profit, and that's fine. I guess the other side of this is we need to be careful about putting a premium on ethical products. That's something I feel very strongly about, and I think we need to be careful of that. But I think that's part of the communication. I think as long as the information is upfront and it's honest and it's as transparent as possible, we should be able to turn the tides and encourage people to opt in for those items. And yeah, I think you had a really good example from a festival.
It was a festival example I saw speak actually at I think it was at Green Events Innovations conference that Greener Festival run, and it was a festival who tried out one more ethically printed t-shirt and one sort of more standard one, and they actually had both at the merch stand, with the more ethical one more expensive, but they explained the difference to audiences, and they did actually sell more of the more expensive, more ethical t-shirt. So I think as Ross said, it's kind of, if you can be very clear almost on what that extra money is doing, and there's lots of, particularly in the fashion industry, there's lots of campaigns as well that you can use to get information to highlight as well to consumers. For example, on the workers' rights side, things like Fashion Revolution, people asking, how did my clothes get made? That was in response actually to a really tragic incident that killed a lot of garment workers, and sort of now this push to actually we have to pay more because we can't in good conscience be supporting an industry that would put the lives of workers at risk. And so if it costs more, then it has to cost more, but that's where that money is going. So telling that story, I think telling that human story, telling the why story is really important. We had a question from Nigel on thoughts of end-of-life technology, things like old speakers and amps. How do you balance the quality needed versus making the most of gear you already have? So I think particularly with the UK is one of the biggest producers of waste electronics in the world per head. And it is quite a big environmental challenge because it can be really toxic to dispose of electronics, let alone the waste that goes into it. So if you can expand the lifetime of the gear that you use, then do it. Please do it. If it means refurbishing and so on and so forth. But the other thing as well is looking for a second life for it. I think we have got a lot of schools, other educational establishments and others that are kind of really struggling, especially over the last few years of cuts and resources. So if you can give any gear that's still totally workable, but maybe just not for you anymore, a second life, then look for those networks in your community that you might be able to place that gear with. And if you are getting rid of any old speakers or amps or other electronic equipment, please take it to the recycling center where it gets disposed in a very specific waste stream so that it doesn't sort of leach awful toxins into everything else.
Yeah, I think just on that, because I've been through that process recently. I think if you're in any of the big cities, there's usually specific electronic recycling bins next to the other recycling. You might have to go to a specific location for it. They're not as widely available, but certainly any traditional kind of waste management facility will have a electronic specific recycling or disposal area. So yeah, absolutely use that.
But yeah, if it's still in working order, do try to give it a second life first. Natalie asked, should artists do less shows to reduce their impact or more shows in different locations so that audiences have to travel less far to see the shows? I think this is in some ways $1 million question, and one we may never quite have a full answer to, because the comparison really depends. For example, if a really big name band does a tour where people are going to get on an airplane to see that show, then probably they could reduce the overall impact of their tours by playing more and smaller shows so that audiences are traveling less far. That's not necessarily obvious for all artists, though. So if you're not the kind of artist where people are going to get on a plane to see you, then it's going to make less of a difference. So I think it's a question that we're all kind of thinking about, but the answers aren't necessarily as straightforward as we might want them to be. Yeah, I think is the answer to that. It's slightly comparing apples and pears as well, in the sense that, yes, so yeah, smaller music venues that draw more local audiences who really are traveling by public transport, in some ways, will have a much lower impact per show, but yeah, you can't necessarily compare that to an arena tour. Marta asks, in relation, there are many tools right now to measure impacts. Which ones do you recommend focusing on? So I think it depends a little bit on what you need it for and what you're using it for. So Julie's Bicycle, we have our Creative Green tools, which are free carbon calculators that can be used by offices, venues, tours, and festivals. And we built those to make sort of carbon footprinting as accessible to as many SMEs and organizations in the arts and creative industries as possible. So if you want to give it a go, it's ig-tools.com. I'll post it in the comments in a second. What we don't have through that is we don't directly link in with any kind of offset providers or anything like that, because what we wanted to do was create a standalone tool, sort of free from any kind of commercial interest, that you could just use to measure, and then you decide what you want to do with that. Of course, there's a lot of really good tools as well that are linked into specific projects. Equilibrium has a travel carbon calculator, for example, that they offer, through which you can then directly invest in one of the Equilibrium projects. And I know, Ross, that you've used some as well that are linked to sort of what you want to do with the impact at the end.
Yeah, and I was just going to say there's a great tool that I found out about the other day called Geeky, Giki, which is more for kind of individual impact. So it goes quite in depth into your kind of behaviors and lifestyle, and therefore it kind of gives you a slightly more accurate readout of what your current impact is. It allows you to add in things like tree planting, or if you recycled all of your food, or whatever. There's a lot of detail in there. So there are lots of tools available. I think just find one that you feel gives you the most amount of information, because it's likely to be most accurate. But yes, the creative tools one is fantastic, very, very detailed. Took me a minute to get used to it, but there's lots in there.
Yeah, again, I think what the hopefully what the creative green tools do is because you can create an account on them, you can actually keep track of different areas of impact over multiple years as well. So you could put your office in there, you could put different tours in there, and actually it sort of sums up that total. And then you can, if you use it over multiple years, you can actually do comparisons. So it's a little bit more of a business tool, I guess, than necessarily just an individual tool. And as Ross said, there's some brilliant other ones out there too. Great. I think we are on and slightly over time. So I think as there are no more questions, we're going to wrap here. But thank you so much to Ross for sharing all of your insights. Thanks to everyone who's tuned in as well for sharing your questions. If you can, do watch back any of the other Live Green webinars as well that are on the live YouTube channel, and subscribe to the YouTube channel to get notifications about future webinars too. Thanks so much to Live for having us, and thanks to Ross, and thanks to you. Bye.